Hi guys, and welcome to the Knowledge Panel episode 21, and we're talking about JavaScript SEO. And as normal, I've got a fantastic panel with me, and I was chatting with them before we came on, and it's really good to have Joe and Jamie. I reckon these guys are going to certainly put me in my place when I start going off on one.
You know what you did.
Through. Yes, absolutely. So we got, and it's really nice to see you guys as well. Joe, why don't you, for the benefit of the audience, tell everyone who you are and where do you come from?
My name is Joe Hall. I am a technical SEO consultant. I've been doing this for way too long. I am from Columbia, South Carolina.
And we met 12 years ago, something like that?
Yeah, something like that. It was a time when it was much a hazier time for both of us, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd like to say I've stopped drinking since then, but you know.
Well, nobody's perfect, Dixon.
No, yeah. I know.
Except for me. Yeah.
Anyways, good to see you again, albeit online. And Jamie, how are you?
Hey, love. I'm doing very well. Yesterday in Denver, it was 65. It is snowing right now. I am a technical SEO.
Do that? That's incredible. That's just Denver for you, isn't it?
It is. It's like if you don't like the weather, just wait a day. And that's where we're at. There's actually a lot of the Deep Crawl crew based out of Denver, which is pretty great. I get to see my teammates, even though we're all remote. I'm a senior technical SEO with the Deep Crawl crew.
And I've just been told, you told me that you're coming over to Brighton.
Yes, exciting news. Fingers crossed ticket isn't booked yet, but I should be good to go out and see all of you lovely folks. I haven't been to an event since the long ago, the before times.
I was going to say, I think I've just used my spare free ticket, but Deep Crawl's bound to have loads of tickets, so because they're the sponsor.
Come hang out, come be our friends. It'll be fun.
Yeah, absolutely, good. Well, it would be nice to see you and in Brighton. So that's good. And Joe, you're thinking about going to Mexico for deep sea SEO?
I know for certain that I'm speaking at Deep Sea SEO. I don't know if I will be there.
Okay.
It is sort of a hybrid event, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
But it is in Mexico. The last time I went to Mexico, it's a really long story, but I had some trouble getting back. And I don't want to jinx it and do that again. So, yeah. So
we've got a few months to try and convince you otherwise. Then.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I will definitely be speaking there. If one way or the other, I'll be speaking. So yeah.
Excellent. Oh, my friend Lucas is sitting there in the audience as well. So thanks for coming in, Lucas. I know in about 30 seconds you'll be concentrating on something else, but if you want to jump in with any questions or add your 2p, Lucas, please do type in the chat and it'd be great. And of course, this wouldn't all work without my producer, David. Do you want to come in and tell me all the things I should have talked about that I forgot before we start?
I just want to mention the fact that many people will be listening to this on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts. But if you're doing that, come and watch us live. Just sign up at theknowledgepanelshow.com. We've got another show coming up next month that I'll tell you about towards the end of this one. So if you can watch us live, that's absolutely wonderful. Then you can interact a little bit and you can ask your own questions.
Brilliant. Excellent. So guys, I want to jump in with JavaScript and JavaScript SEO, and if I tend to start these things with some. So if people haven't got time to stay for the whole show, and they've come in and said, right, I think I should know about something about JavaScript and JavaScript SEO. What one takeaway, Jamie, should people, run off with? What's the bit that you kind of wish everybody, knew before they came in?
First off, hi, loves. Thank you for listening to the podcast. I hope your errands go great and your hair looks fabulous today. The downside, bad news we're going to share with you is even if you hate JavaScript, it's not going anywhere. Just because SEOs don't love it doesn't mean we can stop it. So embrace the chaos, ride the wave. Don't forget to pick up your dry cleaning and have a lovely day.
But didn't we say that about Flash? And it's gone.
Well, 98% of the internet wasn't using Flash, so let's counterbalance that expectation.
Well, that's true. That's true. Yeah, Joe, what about you? A takeaway that people might go away with if that they need to know about JavaScript SEO.
Yeah, I think Jamie's right. I mean, I don't think it's going anywhere. And I think that's a lesson that I've learned over the years, is that with SEO, you have to kind of always kind of accept what you cannot change. It's the old Serenity prayer. But I think that one thing with JavaScript is I think that people need to understand how it should be utilized to build different types of content, and then how it shouldn't. And I think that for me, my major frustration with JavaScript is that it's being utilized in ways that it doesn't need to be utilized, and for ways and reasons that don't really make a lot of sense from a marketing perspective.
Can you give an example?
Well, I just think that there's a lot of really great JavaScript libraries out there, like Angular and React and whatnot. And Jamie, you're an expert on those kind of things. But I think that those are really great for building things like web applications, and things that need to have like that client-side rendering and client-side processing. But from a marketing perspective, we're dealing with a code base that doesn't need to be so complicated on the client side, and needs to really focus on accessibility, from not just standard accessibility, but also just general accessibility for robots and crawlers and users and screen readers and everybody. And so we don't need to focus totally on such a heavy JavaScript, framework like Angular or whatever,
Hear me out. I'm going to counter that one. Because
Okay.
usually it's not Angular's fault. It's not React's fault. It is the 75 marketing pixels. Why do you have all of them? The next time a vendor comes to you and says, it's magic, just plug and play this directly above the opening head tag. Tell them not today. If your tools, measure the ROI of these third-party tools. They impact your performance. If it's a blocking script, you are dependent on their response time to be performant. Don't blame the poor Angular.
Those little scripts, those little pixel scripts and things that you've got all over the place, and I hear you. I kind of sit there, and every time my page is looking slow to load, I'm sitting there looking down in the bottom left-hand corner of my screen, and awesome fonts or something is sitting there taking up some time, and and it seems that all these third-party scripts are taking the time. How many of those get fixed with a defer tag? Because in Links we use Inlinks is all built around people injecting one line of JavaScript code on the website, and it injects the schema and the internal links and stuff, which is good or bad depending on who you are, but we use the defer tag so that it shouldn't be a sort of anything
render
that
blocking resource,
blocks the scripts. Yeah. And I wonder, why can't you use that with all those scripts, with all those things? Why can't you just always use a defer tag?
I think you can, but I think the issue is the resource still has to load eventually, and I'm not sure that deferring JavaScript fixes things like first interactive and stuff like that. The scripts still have to load eventually.
Sure, but if it's a tracking script, you frankly don't want it. You don't want it to load at the expense of the user.
Well, the other thing too. This is interesting that we're talking about performance, because there's been sort of a breakaway in the performance space where there's been this debate of whether or not should you be optimizing for like the tool sets, or should you be optimizing for the actual user experience, and you can defer scripts like crazy, and you can even delay scripts and preload scripts and all that stuff, and get these amazing scores. But it really doesn't, it can screw things up in some ways. So like there's a method that you can basically delay tracking scripts until user interaction. And when you do that, that's great, but it could screw up your analytics as well, And so I think that it's just one of those situations where you kind of have to balance the two, and it's a case by case basis, It just depends, I guess, is the right way to say it,
I love the cat, Jamie. What's the cat's
He
name?
decided yet again to crash a webinar. This is Tank. He's very professional. You can see he has a tiny little bow tie here.
Yeah, I do apologize to everybody on a podcast. Actually, we might have to edit out the tank cat thing. So, and Giacomo seems to be very happy that we've got a cat involved in the whole thing in the audience there. Okay, so fair enough. I take your point. So defer tag could also screw up your website. That's a fair point, really. Okay, we got a couple of people are joining in here. Hang on, lots of comments coming in. Most of them about nice kissing, but there we go. Anyway, let's dive into my next bugbear in JavaScript-based websites. And honestly, we're talking about this, and Jamie was going to give me sass, and I'm sure Joe will give me sass as well. But one of my pet hates with JavaScript websites is that I'm trying to use it, and then there's a bit that I want to share with on social media with my colleagues, and it's the same bloody link as 5 minutes ago because I've been doing everything using JavaScript and the URL hasn't changed, so I can't share anything with anybody on social. And the annoying thing is that also happens on inlinks.net as well. And Fred, the CTO at Inlinks, who sponsor this just in case I needed to get an advert out for Inlinks, he's a bloody good SEO. So why the hell does he do this to me every single time? I want every bit of JavaScript to have a different URL. I don't know. Why does that happen? Why is there so much stuff on the same URL?
Can I tell you the good word? Have you heard the good word about history push state APIs? This beautiful thing where you can change the address and give each asset its own beautiful, unique location.
Okay. So what is that? How do you do that?
So push state's going to go ahead and update the address bar, or when you're doing like an infinite scroll, which sounds like you're in another piece of content, you've been going and going and going, and you try and share it out, but it's not reflecting the content that you're on now. This is also a problem people see when they've got infinite scroll on their sites. There's a way to go ahead and update very easily and accepted across all browsers the address that you're on.
So basically, so when do you use this command, this push state command?
Anytime the content changes, update it.
Okay.
But it is up to the developer to do that. I mean, they have to implement that, and I think that that's a really good, I think, a workaround that SEOs should, I think, push more when working with sites. That type of push happens. And that is the preferred method with continuous scroll. Sites to update the. I think does it work with the rel next or rel prep on that kind of thing?
Yeah. So you're changing it.
Yeah. So I mean that kind of thing is great. I think that from a usability standpoint, I think that's what you're mostly talking about, Dixon. I mean, doing what Jamie's saying, I think is what devs should be focusing on. And that needs to be implemented more. We need to talk about that more. I guess
if you're using an infinite scroll, then I guess I'm just trying to understand really as a simple-minded guy in this regard, at least. And I'm scrolling down an infinite scroll. Does that URL start changing in the address bar as you're scrolling down?
Yeah, that's how when you're on a page, you can go to and come back, and you can stay where you were.
Right.
So you clicked a link and then you wanted to go back to the content you were at instead of being shot to the top and you've been scrolling for 10 minutes and it's game over. You're not going back to that. That infinite scroll lets you go back, or the update of the address bar lets you go back to exactly where you were.
Okay.
Yeah, as long as that's implemented, that works really well. And we need to talk more about that. I think that's something that SEOs should talk more about is utilizing that as a workaround for the URL issue that you're talking about, you know.
So when you do that, do you think Google is quite happy to then index? Because then potentially then you've got an infinite number of URLs, I guess. Because if you've got a scroll that's continually changing numbers as you're scrolling down, have you then got infinite URLs, which could be argued as duplicate content? Do you just change one problem for another?
Well, it needs to have an index array. It needs to have a known limit. If you have 100 pages worth of content, don't let it go ahead and start requesting page 200 and resolving with a 200.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and then also, I mean, that's just an area where you would just use proper canonicalization. If you know, depending on what the content is, depending on what we're working with here, you might just want to use a proper use of canonical tag. You know, in that situation, you know, it just depends on what the content is and what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, on Index's site, I mean, because you just got to go to the homepage, and if you put a URL in, you don't even have to log into the system. You can put a URL in, and what it does is it reads that page and runs our own natural language or named entity extraction algorithm, and it uses Google's API and compares the entities that Google sees versus the ones that we see. And my URL hasn't changed. I can't show all these reports as a marketing guy. I'd like to just pimp that out and saying, hey, look, Google can't pick up these 300 entities on a page. And it just wasn't built that way. And we're too busy to building other stuff now to go.
It's a really low lift change.
Yeah. Okay.
It's quite low lift.
I'm going to tell Fred this.
For the ROI of being able to share these assets you've worked so hard to make, if you build them and no one else can access them, do they count?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I'm with you. It's just
I'll
the
send
marketing
you
guy telling the dev guy, and you get into trouble at these kind of things when you try and do that. So I will try again. Excellent. Okay. Let's talk about let's talk about the difference between JavaScript SEO and JavaScript frameworks, because that's something, Jamie, you were talking about before we came on. Really,
Yeah.
people have misconceptions about the two different. What is the difference? I'm in the crowd that has misconceptions.
Most sites are using JavaScript. 98% of the internet has JavaScript running on it. JavaScript's expensive, and I think that's one of the things earlier when we were talking about just because we can doesn't mean we should, because you have to ship that. Browser has to build it all. It's expensive. It's one of the heaviest things on the internet right now, according to the last Internet Archive study. So the Web Almanac's a great resource. There's a whole chapter on JavaScript in there. It's really important to differentiate JavaScript running on any given page, which is how you have a lot of analytics firing off, your tag managers, versus the JavaScript framework. Something like React, Vue, Angular. Honestly, you could like coffeemug.js is probably a framework by now. There's millions of them. They're everywhere. And optimizing for them looks very different depending on what they are, because some of these are client-side render, which means it's like an IKEA ship. They send you all the parts, your browser builds it up. Some of them serve, the server builds it when you request it and they send it back. So that's their server-side render. Static, They have a copy ready to go. It's like when you go to Voodoo Donuts, which is a great place here in Denver, and you pick out a very bougie, fancy Portland cream donut. And, there's one in display, but there's also a bunch ready to hand over to you. Optimizing for them looks different because it depends on how they're built. If everything is client-side, I'm really sorry. That is a nightmare. Every script that is rendered client-side has a probability of breaking, and you have no insight into when or how it broke. So something could be broken for a fair amount of time, and you have no earthly idea.
So, okay, I get that. Joe, I mean, what do you find yourself mostly playing with? You said earlier on before we came on, you hate doing SEO for JavaScript, but you quite like programming in it, which I guess is the difference between server side and client side JavaScript.
Yeah, I hate to even admit what I enjoy programming in, but I'm an old school guy, so I really like jQuery, and I know a lot of people don't like jQuery, but I still really like jQuery. I think it's really easy to use. But going back to what Jamie said, I think that this is what I was talking about before we started the podcast, about how we as a community talk about these frameworks and talk about how they're utilized and whatnot. And what you were saying, Jamie, about how the likelihood that some things are going to break or whatever is something that we don't talk about enough. And I think that that's something that needs to be understood is that, and I'm guilty of this as well. Is like we'll do like a test, like I'll run a test on to see if this works or whatever, and then I'll come out and put a tweet out and say, oh, I just tested this thing in JavaScript and it works, but at least for myself, and I imagine for many other people, when we do tests like that, we don't do them at scale, right? So just because it worked on one page that I wrote the script on,
It works on my machine.
yeah, exactly. It works on my browser. It worked here.
Oh,
It worked here where it worked this one time that Google indexed the page. But the problem I have, and the problem I see a lot of, is these pages that have like 10, 20,000 URLs that are utilizing a client-side render on each page, and if it's something like their client-side rendering a batch of internal links on every page, well, okay, if just one of those pages has an error during the crawl, or maybe even a batch of those pages have an error during the crawl, it can significantly cut down the internal crawl and the internal link equity spread for that crawl. And like Jamie said, if you don't know how long it's been like that, then you could significantly be cutting down internal link equity spread as a result of that. And so it's one of those situations where I really don't like client-side rendering for that reason, because I'm worried that there's all these opportunities for it to break on the search engine side, and it's going to significantly hurt you if it does break. And that's why I'm just kind of always really uneasy about it, even when I see things like that work well, because Angular and React, they both have kind of good ways to get around all that. Like they've got different things you can do to implement server-side rendering and whatnot. But it's still that opportunity for failure can still occur, and so I think that we need to talk about, like, as a community, when we talk about these things, we should say, okay, look, like, you can do this, but should you, and you can implement these tools and whatnot, but here are the risks in doing that, not just saying, yes, well, it works, so do it, I think that's kind of dangerous for some sites,
So, I mean, on that, then, how do you check it? I mean, surely there's got to be a way to check that the JavaScript is running properly and on pages. How do you go about checking that sort of stuff? Jamie, you're going to say use deep crawl, or can't you check it on that either?
well, here's the thing. Yeah, you can, but it's a probability of failing. Every single one of them is a probability.
Yeah.
So a lab test has a set boundary of where it's running from, how it's running, what it's emulating. In the real world, somebody with shoddy cell phone reception walking behind a really blocking building could change how that page loads. And it's worth noting that there's 4 causes of poor LCP. One of them is client-side rendering.
Yeah.
This is significant. You are asking that browser to go ahead and assemble everything. Many times these users are on mobile. If they're outside the US, data is expensive. And we are shipping so many things that they don't need. I gave the analogy of like, it's client-side rendering is like going and getting a flat pack bookshelf from IKEA. Well, half the time they ordered a bookshelf, we also sent them half a table set as well. They didn't need it. It doesn't function, has no purpose, but we sent it and they had to assemble it.
I love that
Yeah,
analogy.
that makes sense. Yeah, and I to continue that analogy, Amazon now has a service where they will come to your place and assemble an item. Have you guys seen this? Like you can actually hire somebody to come to your house and assemble whatever you've got. And I think that if we could work that into this JavaScript analogy, like maybe somehow if a site decides to use client-side rendering, could they somehow send us like a batch of more bandwidth or something? I don't know how that would work, but that that would be super cool if we could say, okay, like the responsibility of making this work needs to be clearly on you if you decide to do this the client side rendering.
But presumably,
Um,
you can use a lighthouse or something to just see which or just look at the code to see which JavaScript files are being called,
mhm.
and make a list, and then have a look at whether those JavaScript files have got a good reputation, are maintained. Because most of those are going to be file names that are used all over the web, surely.
They can be, but here's the thing. Anytime you rely on a third party's code, you also have a security risk, you have a performance risk. The most performant and secure assets are those you don't ship. So we tend to do kitchen sink tags on our sites. We keep adding scripts and adding things and adding features and adding functionalities until it is so absolutely bloated that we are just a dragon with a bunch of Allen wrench keys going, this is fine. It's not how the experience we want to give our users. We can't just ship all of this off without being considerate of how we're using their bandwidth. There are options out there where we could do things that split the difference. So something like progressive hydration that would let us ship the hero content, that which the user is coming for, critical things like meta tags, all of the good bits. And then that secondary, that tertiary content that can be loaded in the client's browser. That footer, no one cares about your footer. Like, load that client side. That's fine.
Yeah. And then also this is kind of in a way, this is where we kind of get into the marketing kind of thing. Is one of the things I see having a lot of issues are all of the conversion tracking scripts. Those are really a pain in the butt, and it's I think that it's hard being an SEO and telling another marketing department, hey, like, please don't load those scripts, like, because and they're like, well, how are we supposed to do our job, the CROs, so I think that, like, I think what Jamie's talking about is loading those critical assets, first, and prioritizing everything else makes a lot of sense. It does get a little bit sticky though, telling like the CROs, hey, like, your JavaScript isn't as important as like everyone else's,
But it comes
yeah.
down to their execution. I've been a CRO. I've seen when you use a global tag, when you block that entire page while you're waiting for your third-party A/B testing platform tool, you are crashing your conversion rate, whether it's control or
Sure.
variant. I
That's a
have the
good
data
point.
for that.
That's a
So
good point. Yeah.
only block what you need.
Yeah.
Make that element.
Here is surely this is the problem with that argument is that and I remember Martin Splitz talking about it, who's Google's JavaScript SEO guys, for those who are on the podcast that want to know who he is. And he says, it's really good that you should only deliver JavaScript code when that page actually needs the code. Don't just bundle everything into one big JavaScript file that does everything. Break those out, but don't break them out into 10 files. If all 10 files have to load, then you may as well just have one call to the computer. But the problem with that logic is that some pages need certain functionality and other pages don't need that functionality. And it's very difficult for us as for you guys as the developers to know in advance which pages, which of them is going to be needed.
For that. There's no way a human can go through and map that out, but there are tools for tree shaking and for code splitting. You could put Webpack in your pipeline and it goes, okay, this page uses this code.
But you don't. So let's say you're using some kind of thing for resizing images or something like that, but the thing is, you don't necessarily know whether there are images on the page that need resizing. You would if you went through manually and you found this kind of stuff out. But what I'm saying is that is the logic of trying to know exactly which JavaScript files to call and which ones not to call isn't that easy to do in real life. Surely it's.
I don't think it. You're right. It's not easy, but I think that more sites can do a better job of it. And I think that one of the ways that you do that is you have a good understanding of really, like, what I tend to do is break up sites into page types, and I understand, like, if I say, okay, I know that blog posts don't need this JavaScript. I know that your primary landing pages don't need this JavaScript, and give the developers more direction in that regard. so that they can make some kind of case-based rules or whatever they want to on the back end to, not, to exclude certain pieces out of certain page types, But I think that's kind of the way you can kind of go with it. Because I actually have a client right now who has about 30 pages that have video content embedded on them. And they have a video player, a JavaScript video player, but the site is like thousands of pages, and only 30 of them have video content, but they're loading the JavaScript files for that content on every page, and so that kind of thing is kind of common sense. Like, say, okay, look, these JavaScript assets are only for, your videos that are playing on these 30 pages in the video section. Let's eliminate that site-wide except for those 30 pages. So I do think that you can definitely, there are a lot of opportunities for that, where you look at opportunities like that, and a lot of sites can do better with that. But you're right, it is difficult. If you really want to get granular with it, you can use a tool like Deep Crawl, for example, I imagine, Jamie, to figure that out on a page by page basis by looking at like individual footprints or whatever to put in to understand, okay, we know that these pages are the ones that need this asset because of what our crawl data says, So I think it's possible, but it is difficult. It's a difficult task, and it's a difficult ask from an SEO. It's difficult to go to a development team and say, look, we need you to only load the JavaScript on these individual pages, because let's face it, it's just so much easier to slap it in a template somewhere and, call it a day. So I get it. Like, I think it's possible. I think more websites could do a better job of it, even if it's hard.
So how would you go about optimizing that? What scripts are called, Jamie?
I would automate it using a library like Webpack, so it can go ahead and do the code splitting and tree shaking for me. Alternatively, if that's not an option, let's look at what's in that global bin. What are we shipping on every page, and go, some of these only fire on specific templates. So then we begin to enter that conditional logic Joe mentioned, where, if the template is the video player, then we load the script.
Yeah.
Look in that global junk drawer.
So Webpack, I remember Martin Splits also mentioning Webpack. So, that was a good sign. So can you explain Webpack a little bit? Because it sounds like a resource that probably, we should know
Absolutely.
about.
It's available on GitHub. It builds into React really easily and a bunch of other frameworks. It's simply a library that you add, and when you go ahead and build the pages, it handles that identification of what scripts are used and where they're used, and will only ship what is needed. Because fundamentally, all of discussion around JavaScript comes to the fallibility of rendering, and Core Vitals is measuring how effective we render. So if we can go ahead and load what matters when it matters, we provide a performance site regardless of how much or how little JavaScript's in play.
So if I'm a simpleton with a WordPress website, well, sorry, not simpleton. I'm a WordPress man, so I use my WordPress websites, and I'm sure that I've got loads and loads of plugins that are hopefully not too many. And I have had people telling me off.
That's your junk drawer. It's time for us to go through and clean up that junk drawer.
But of course, the junk drawer, even when I decide which plugins I do keep out of those, the majority of those plugins will probably load those JavaScript files on every single. And a video player is a pretty good example of that. If I've got if I've got a video and I want to speed up that video, and I suddenly find a plugin that says this will, load your video player much quicker. So I put it in and add it, and thinking I'm speeding up the website. But Joe, what you're telling me is I'm speeding up the page with the video and slowing down every other page. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, it depends. Like, and I hate to, honestly, I do a lot of WordPress development, and I'm a WordPress bias. So I will say that if you are loading a video plugin, and it puts out JavaScript on every page, then it's a bad plugin, right? Because there's definitely ways to localize those scripts only on pages that they are needed. And then I hate to recommend using another plugin, but there are plugins out there that can help this process and streamline it. Perf Matters is a great plugin for WordPress that can help you eliminate unneeded JavaScript on pages that are not using it. There's some other options out there too. Other plugins.
Is there a Webpack for SEO for WordPress? I don't know. Is there a Webpack plugin for WordPress?
I don't know, Jamie. Is there?
Looking it up while we're going.
There's a million and one plugins for WordPress, and here's the thing: you have to be judicious in deciding which ones to use. And they are very much an ecosystem where you could put in one that optimizes for one thing but hurts all the other things. So be patient, be aware of security risks that come with any of these. Don't forget that British Airways got hacked real good by 16 lines of JavaScript added onto a third-party script they found in every page.
Yeah, I think that's one thing about WordPress. It's really easy to make mistakes because there is so much out there, so much available. I will say, I don't think that if you have a website that, a WordPress website that you care about, I would not add plugins without help if you don't know what you're doing. And you really need to understand what that plugin is doing and how that plugin works and what the major kind of features are for it. And also, you should only add plugins that are regularly maintained and regularly updated.
And I think that's pretty much, you can have a look at the community behind that plugin really easily before you start.
You can. Yeah,
and
that's
really good.
Yes, we can. Yeah.
I mean, I could go ahead and release a plugin right now that'd be like, makes your page faster, and it just puts flame decals on it.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of
remove the code. Just remove the code. Nice white page there.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a great library that's called Thanos.js, and it just snaps half the code off the page. I think it's the best thing ever. Automatically makes your site more performance, 50% lighter.
You're only allowed to program in 20 lines of code. The whole page got to go in 20 lines. That sounds a good way to force people to optimize.
Good JavaScript is like physics. It's beautiful and simple and completely baffling.
That's true.
Okay, so let's talk about a little bit about DOMs and view source versus inspect and the differences for people, because I before another naive thing that I said before I came on is I never use view source anymore, and you both kind of looked at me and said, why wouldn't you use view source? Because I'm always using the inspect and assuming that I don't want to use view source because I want to see what the rendered code is. Why has Google kept Chrome view source in the Chrome as an option when they've got inspect? And what's the difference anyway for everybody else?
It's part of the pixel pipeline, my friend. If you have a no index tag in that view source, it's never going to get rendered to see the index. So it's an order of operations. We think of Google as this giant monolith. It's code. Code runs in order. It starts with viewing the HTTP responses, and it moves through the source, that it grabs all the resources and renders.
So, but then does that mean that if you put no index in a JavaScript tag, it'll render?
If you put no index in a JavaScript tag and it renders on the page, it's a way to handle software 4s. Yeah. Absolutely. It'll render it, but it used a lot more resources to get there and then find out none of it was valuable.
That it didn't need any of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So the whole thing here is the difference between view source and the rendered JavaScript. That's where the interesting bit lies for trying to optimize JavaScript for SEO. Would you say?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that the view source is let me give you a little bit of a history of myself and help to explain my perspective. I come from a time when the term server-side rendering didn't exist because that was all that we did. There was no such thing as client-side rendering. JavaScript back then was kind of included to create a more rich experience, but it never was responsible for actually rendering content, So I think that with that perspective, view source is server side rendering. It is what comes directly from the server, and it's not the client side rendered version of the page. So I think what I use the view source for a lot is comparing the two and understanding, okay, if there's something showing up in the rendered version in Chrome tools, then that means, and it's not showing up in the view source, that means that it's client side rendered. And if that is something that, it helps with SEO or is a part of the SEO process, then that should be understood, and it doesn't mean that the engines are not seeing it. It just means that they're having to go through an extra layer of work to see it, and so I think that's why I use the view source and the Chrome dev tools and spec tools and stuff like that to make a difference between the two,
Okay.
Yeah.
James, do you want to jump in on anything of that, or?
I mean, it should be part of your processing pipeline. No matter how far in the long ago, in the before times we all came from, like Hummingbird, Panda, the great farmer updates. This is where we are now. This is our reality. And just like your browser, you are optimizing for an experience that involves JavaScript. That pipeline starts with the initial request. We get that HTML, initial HTML response, which is the view source. We can look at the network tab in Chrome DevTools and see what resources are being called. So then we know what else Google has to go run and fetch in order to make that page. So we've moved from view source to let's look at the network tab. If one of those resources is blocked, the content that it generates can't attribute to the page. When we see that full DOM, we could do something like comparing the output from URL Inspector to that which we have in a live page, which you can copy and paste out of URL Inspector. They added a fine functionality into the rendered HTML there, and I love it. And you can compare that to what you have in your users page and see where the gaps are. It's very useful. It's important to note, though, when you do a live test bypasses Google's extremely aggressive cache. They are ignoring your max age tag because no one used it right, and this is what happens. So if you do a live test, you're going to see a lot more resources unavailable, probably from asynchronous threads and chaos and cake. That's okay. Use that cache version instead. Compare and see, are pieces of my content missing? If pieces of the content are missing and they're in the view source, they're in our initial HTML, that means they were overwritten and not included in that DOM. Google flattens the DOM as it goes. It doesn't keep a copy of the DOM and this bit, every piece of script as it runs. They don't crawl the internet to be altruistic, and JavaScript is expensive. So it behooves them to go ahead and reuse resources where possible and to keep a single version rather than the layers and layers that we tend to have in our sites.
Okay. So I love your alliteration as you walk through that. But I didn't get what's a spectre? What's my spectre?
Spectre?
You
Inspector.
said spectre. Oh, inspector. Okay,
Inspector.
sorry.
URL
Okay,
Inspector.
sorry.
Yes, I'm now going to call URL Inspector Spectre. It's the ghost
I thought there was something out of
Carl's
James
past.
Bond coming through here. Yeah. So good. Okay.
Hello, Blofeld.
I'm going to finish with one last thing that I'd like to ask about, and it's more of a theoretical, but I suspect it's not theoretical. I bet it's got some very real problems emerging on the horizon. Last few webinars that we've had on the podcast, the Knowledge Panel, we've talked about the edge and doing things through Cloudflare or Akamai and using SEO, injecting links or injecting schema or redirects or whatever at the cloud level, at the edge level via the CDN. And I'm wondering now whether, that's trying to get in even earlier than the damn server. And I'm wondering now whether there is likely to be some clashes between JavaScript and injecting things through a CDN. I don't know if that's something that you've found, had issues with, or got some theoretical problems with, or never thought about before. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in with any thoughts on that.
I don't think that there are any major conflicts with it. I think it depends on how that CDN or the edge level SEO is being implemented. I know some of the edge level SEO that I've heard about utilizes JavaScript in some ways, and others don't. But from a theoretical perspective only, if the site is using a CDN, then it's all kind of the same. Especially if that CDN is utilizing some form of caching, like Cloudflare does, then you're already making that request from the CDN to begin with. So I don't think there'd be a lot of conflicts. I'm not sure though. I mean, I don't see it being an issue though.
I have some
Okay.
clients who've had great success. That's really useful, particularly in sites with a lot of tech debt, where
Yeah,
it's a little bit of code spaghetti and Jenga, and something
Yeah.
can seem really dumb, but if you remove it, everything stops working.
Yeah.
So there's a boon to it. They can go ahead and basically take all of the chaos that you were going to ship to the client and cruft out that which wasn't necessary, add in some pieces that are. The only time, because again, it's following a pipeline. We're going from server to CDN, then passing along to our users. The time I could see a problem would be in the devil's details. So if in the CDN you are flattening everything, you are not shipping any of your JavaScript, things like your tracking tag would not run. But you can add exceptions into there. So it's really about how you do it.
yeah. Yeah, and another thing about the edge SEO that I've heard from most SEOs that utilize it is that it makes the SEO process much more manageable. For especially when you're working with a company that has a big team and it's hard.
Sure, it does. However, if you're the SEO and you're going control of Cloudflare, Rob, what's coming? I'll ask that question in a second. But if you're in control of Cloudflare, you could really screw up the developers because developers can't work out why the hell their thing isn't working.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, but it has to be sort of like this agreement, you know. I mean, if Dev Team can't get to your tickets for another 6 months, then they have to agree to give you
a workaround.
Yeah, give you a workaround. And I mean, that's just kind of like a simple kind of a compromise you make with the dev team and say, look, like if you can't give us this in 6 months, then at least let's do this instead, and we'll work with you and keep you informed of everything that we're doing, and kind of coexist in that regard. But yeah, it is a lot easier for a lot of SEOs that manage enterprise accounts and whatnot to have that level of access, you know.
Okay, David, can you bring up that question from Joe, that comment from Rob Watson? I'll just read it out for the
It's
podcast.
a great one. Thanks,
Rob says, Cloudflare I found removed HTML comments, which I used to test a little thing once. Took me ages to figure it all out. So yes, you have to be careful for sure. That's kind of interesting.
They're doing minification. They're cleaning it up so it's a smaller file. They're removing
you don't need
spaces,
comments in the output code, do you?
Exactly.
You know, like this comment that
Stop
says,
logging
don't
things
read
in the
this.
client's console.
I remember PubCon, Breck Tabka used to use comments in the robots.txt file to advertise for job roles. So, you know, once you started looking at his robots.txt, that's when you could start applying for jobs at PubCon. So,
but you know, that brings up a good point. Rob's point brings up a good point back to what Jamie was talking about having like a clear understanding of the sequence of events, right? So if you're working with a client and stuff like that happens, all your comments disappear. If you are aware of the sequence, if you know that they're using a CDN, then it makes it much more easier to troubleshoot that issue. Because you can say, oh, well, I know they're using Cloudflare, so let me go and check and see if that's a Cloudflare issue. Or it could even be I'm a WordPress guy, so it could even be a WordPress plugin. A lot of these WordPress performance plugins will do the same thing. They'll minify the JavaScript or minify the HTML and remove comments and stuff like that. So if you know the process that you're working in, the sequence of events for that initial request, then you can kind of debug that pretty quickly. Just step through each process in the chain. You know,
it's visibility and awareness into your site's PEMDAS. If you
I like that. I mean, I think that pipe thinking order, Jamie, has been my. I mean, it's pretty obvious when you think about it that, you know, of course, you know, what happens at the DNS level is much more important ultimately than what happens at the server level, which is much more important than what happens at the. But they can all wreck your website. It doesn't really matter. So
I mean, I found a job posting in a header the other day. I thought that was very clever. It was like, hi, found this. Come apply for us.
Absolutely. I think, you know, There's other sites I know that do that as well. Guys, I think we got to the end of our time already. These things don't take very long. I was going to ask about using Google GTM to mess around with your JavaScript tags and things, but I'll have to leave that for another day. So thanks very much for coming on. But just before we go, David, what do we got on next month? On the next
next month.
Session?
Next month, it's not on the usual Monday. It's actually on a Wednesday. That's because Monday the 18th is Easter Monday. So instead, we're going to be doing it 2 days after that on Wednesday the 20th of April. And that particular subject is going to be technical SEO quick wins. We've got a couple of guests booked for that one already. We've got Woyumina Gilbertson Davis from BAT, and we've got Cara McClure from Mindshare. So sign up to watch that one live over at theknowledgepanelshow.com.
Okay, brilliant.
All right,
and
cool.
thanks to Inlinks for sponsoring this stuff, as everywhere. I'm the CEO of Inlinks, so they're always going to have sponsor this thing.
Thank you for sponsoring you. We appreciate all of your
that's
effort.
what you got to say, really. Yeah, absolutely. So, guys, just before you go, if people wanted to find you, because clearly I've got two very, very bright people on the panel, where do the people, Joe, how do they go and find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Joe Hall. I talk about SEO and hot dogs.
And that's Joe with an E for those who are on podcast.
Joe with an E, Hall, on Twitter, and then on LinkedIn. Don't find me on Facebook. I hate Facebook. I'm there, but I'm not pleasant there. So don't
I don't think anybody's pleasant there.
Yeah. So yeah.
I try to be present there.
Yeah,
I'm old. I like Facebook.
I don't try. Yeah.
I like Twitter because it makes you fall in love with a stranger in 280 characters. Meanwhile, Facebook makes you hate your family.
Yeah,
So-
exactly. Yeah.
Echo chamber's not good on Twitter.
No.
It's true. Jamie, how about you? Where do people find you?
I am on Twitter at jammer_volts, or you can just look for the blue hair. It's pretty easy to spot me.
So it's Jammer.
If you're a Brighton, come say hi.
_ volts, as in electrocute yourself. Correct?
Yes.
So that's brilliant, guys. Thank you ever so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. It's been good. I know we were trying to get Nick on as well, Nick Ranger, but we'll get her on another show, so we'll get that sorted. And guys, thanks very much. And for everyone that's watching and listening, please come back again soon. Cheers. Bye, guys.
Cheers.
All right. Thanks. Bye.